irreverent, but honest and tastefully tacky somehow. Here comes another hour of insensitivity training with Glenn Woods.
Well, the Republic is on the radio. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. And if you want to get in on the conversation I'm about to have, you can. 307-363-4093. It is a Thursday. Therefore, we head down to Wyoming Liberty Group, and Amy Edmonds, bright-tailed and bushy-eyed and ready to talk about what I think is, I would guess, Amy, this has got to be some of the most important information in a long time about what's happening in Wyoming schools. And some of that information, wait a second, I'm trying to turn something off. There we go. Some of that information has to do, which we'll get to second, if you don't mind. Some of this information has to do with what schools should have stopped doing a while ago but are still doing. I want to make sure to get with you on that. But you just wrote an article, and it's up on Wyoming Liberty Group's website and up on my website right now. What did you write about?
Well, I wrote about what Wyoming has been doing as far as just overall education policy, and the idea that Wyoming really has just been implementing federal education policy and calling it state education policy. And I talk about why that's really just insane. The federal government doesn't exactly have a great track record in public education, and Wyoming should not simply be following their dictates.
Okay, now, the federal policy, we have to go back to No Child Left Behind. So we were supposed to, let's sort this out for the listeners, supposed to go to new standards, but we got a waiver on old standards, but those old standards are no better than the new standards. It sounds really confusing when I say it, Amy. What am I talking about?
Well, here's a fairly simple description. Under No Child Left Behind, which is a federal piece of legislation passed in 2002, states were required to set standards. They were required to test for those standards, and then they were required to do a series of accountability measures based on the scores from those tests. The waiver that President Obama has allowed states to apply for that gets them out of No Child Left Behind has a whole bunch of mandates as well. And those mandates are that states will adopt one set of standards, which is the Common Core. Essentially, they call them college and career ready standards, which is the Common Core. They'll test for those standards, and then they'll apply a certain amount of accountability based on those test scores. Those two things sound pretty similar, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Okay, so now, which were better? I mean, are the Common Core standards better, or are the old No Child Left Behind standards better, or do they both just stink that much?
You know, No Child Left Behind has widely been accepted as being a failure across the board. So the bigger picture here, Glenn, is not fighting over whether one set of standards are good or bad, or what's great or bad. I mean, the Common Core standards are not great standards, but the bigger picture here is that why is Wyoming initiating federal education policy and calling it our own when we know that the federal government does not succeed in public education policy? No Child Left Behind has been a failure. President Obama's federal initiatives are not going to succeed either. The Common Core is not going to be the silver bullet that everyone thinks it is, and yet the state is turning itself inside out to initiate these programs.
So why do you see that these standards for both, again, No Child Left Behind and Common Core have been such a disaster? Can you pinpoint as to why? I mean, I've got a few reasons of my own, but from where you're sitting, you've written extensively about this. Why are they such a disaster?
Well, I mean, I think the standards reform movement that began even before the Common Core and before No Child Left Behind was just somehow this idea that through stronger standards we were going to create better public schools. I think that entire debate is still really open. It's open to be debated. Do standards really affect, at the end of the day, do they affect student outcomes or do they not? The only paper we've seen, which came from the Brookings Institute, they did some research, and it shows that standards really don't have a huge impact. And yet standards have been a way for the federal government to get their hooks into the states and require them to do a whole bunch of other things. So we've sort of turned ourselves inside out. The problem is that standards are now being dictated by the federal government, a la the Common Core. And these standards are not good standards because they have true pedagogy in them. They are not just a set of neutral standards that your local districts can apply and choose the curriculum. These are very specific, very dictatorial standards. That's a huge issue.
Oftentimes the criticism that we hear from the federal government is, well, your local standards are substandard. Of course, I get a kick out of now. A lot of local governments are firing back. Now, actually, the federal standards are substandards here. So how do you settle the argument about which standard is better, local or, federal standards?
Well, I think we go back to the bigger picture of what is the proper role of government and who should actually be. I mean, we can fight all day long about what set of standards is good and what set of standards is bad. I think at the end of the day, what really matters is who should have the final say in education. That's the bigger picture here. And that's why in this article, I'm really talking about education policy. Because, we can fight until the cows come home. The governor can tell us he just wants good standards, and everyone else can discuss how bad the Common Core standards are. But at the end of the day, Wyoming needs to be pursuing education policy that basically puts primacy on parents, allows parents to choose when and how their children are going to be educated. They need to foster education policy that brings about variety and choice for all of the families of Wyoming. That means we should not be implementing federal education policy. Federal education policy does the exact opposite. They don't want any outliers. They want everyone the same.
Okay. I have to go back. I didn't want to do this quick. I wanted to save it, but I don't think I can. So just recently, some federal standards came our way in education that had to do with science standards. And part of the problem we had with it was all global warming standards put in there as if it was man-made global warming was just fact. And so Wyoming rejected those standards. But apparently, even if standards are rejected, well, some cities around Wyoming still may be implementing them. I mean, I'm a little concerned about what I see happening in Gillette.
Yeah. Yes, well, you're referencing several articles. I mean, I've seen our article at the Casper Star Tribune. Our local districts, yes, here in Laramie County 1, the local district, I've done some looking at their standards on their website, and they have converted all of the higher grades to the next generation science standards. They have not converted the lower grades. And there's a reason, I believe, for that, but they have basically converted all the high grades. The State Board of Education has not adopted the next generation science standards, but districts are doing this. Glenn, we saw this with the Common Core in 2010 and 2009. Laramie County 1 and our largest school districts started converting to the Common Core because they believed that's what the state was going to do, and because they were told. Long before the State Board actually adopted these standards, they were being adopted and changed in our local school districts.
Okay, I'm going to take a break a little bit early if you could. Have someone reset your video because the audio is coming in a little bit warbly on this side. And I want to make sure we can hear some of the questions that I have next for you. Back in, we dive with Amy Edmonds from Wyoming Liberty Group as we talk about public schools across the state. So where I left off with you, and I'm curious as to what we do about this, because I'm not really sure. There seems to be, Amy, a battle going on in states like Wyoming between those people who are convinced in government standards. I wonder sometimes if they're really so much convinced about government standards, or maybe they're just convinced that they need more government money, so they give in to the standards. And those who want local money and local control. So who's winning this one right now in the state of Wyoming?
Well, clearly it's not the local control folks. It's the sort of insider bureaucrats who really are, as I said, implementing federal education policy and calling it Wyoming education policy. We've not really seen unique Wyoming-specific education policy come out of Wyoming for quite a long time.
How do we get that then? I mean, if we're looking for, first off, if we're looking for Wyoming control, what do we do to get that? Is this who our elected officials are?
Well, certainly. I mean, it is who our elected officials are. It's educating those elected officials. It's having more and more people stand up and say that they want the federal government out. From a statewide practical policy application, Wyoming needs to get out of taking federal funds, particularly in the Department of Education. The more that we take federal funds, the more we're on the hook for all these requirements. I mean, in the article that I wrote that you cited, what we're talking about in the article is Wyoming is not applying for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act waiver to waive us out of No Child Left Behind. This will have implications for our local school districts in how they get to spend their Title I funds, which are federal funds that come to our districts. So it's always about the money, Glenn. In most, it's about the money, and school districts will be concerned about how they have to spend their federal funds because we didn't get a waiver. And a lot of people think, well, we should apply for the waiver. This is a good thing. It gets us out of some of these federal requirements. But what I'm trying to say is we need to think bigger picture than that. We need to pull back even further and realize that we're always looking for short-term solutions to all these federal education policy problems. The long-term solution, the permanent solution, is just to get the federal government out of Wyoming education.
Now, there is going to be, and will be if Wyoming went the way of finding our own standards, there'll be another big controversy coming our way, which I'm perfectly willing to get into this controversy. It seems worth it. But how does a state like Wyoming find good standards amidst all the different standards that are out there? What is good for our state?
Well, that's a great question, because we've been looking at that here at the Wyoming Liberty Group, and we've talked in two different areas. We've talked about process, so the process by which Wyoming adopts standards in this state. Every set of standards, if you go back and look at all of the reviews of Wyoming standards since states began setting these standards, which happened about between 1995 and 1998, Wyoming standards have always been graded at Fs or Ds, very bad grades. We have to acknowledge that the process, the way we adopt and create and adopt standards is not working in Wyoming. That system is broken. We need to create a better system. We need to look at states like Massachusetts, and it's a state that we at the Wyoming Liberty Group have looked at. We work with Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who is widely known as one of the women who created an incredible set of standards for the state of Massachusetts. We've talked to her at great length about how she did it, and she did it by doing something really magical in the state of Massachusetts, by bringing the right people at the right time together and create these really, really excellent standards. Wyoming should be addressing that issue.
I just posted an article, I don't remember if I put it on your Common Core page, but a few other pages around the country. I came across an article that shows that right now in the city of New Orleans, and it's spreading across Louisiana because of their governor there, they have closed the last of the public schools. It's now a charter school system, which is a whole different set of standards. I wonder if Wyoming might be interested in looking at something like that.
Well, yeah, Louisiana is such an interesting case study. That all happened because of the hurricane and because the state was literally not able to provide education services. They couldn't get up and going, so they converted their schools to charter schools across almost the entire state, and it's been a very interesting case study. Wyoming is going to see something, I won't say similar to that, Glenn, but realize because we did not apply for an ESEA waiver, and we are now going to be back under the dictates of No Child Left Behind, and under No Child Left Behind, our Wyoming schools should have been 100% proficient this year, 2014. Some of the dictates that happen under No Child Left Behind is that schools actually can be taken over. They can be converted to a charter school. And we're going to see a huge amount of Wyoming schools as being not proficient. So this is going to be an interesting year to see what happens, because all kinds of things are going to kick in now under No Child Left Behind.
Well, now let's go back to some of those standards. I often wonder, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past. So, okay, Wyoming is behind the curve, if you will, according to what states and according to what standards in those states, Amy?
Right. I mean, this is the interesting thing, Glenn. The Fordham Institute is about one of the only places, I think it is actually the only place where we've actually seen what's called the State of State Standards. It's a report that they put out where they grade and judge standards across the country, and they've been doing that for many, many years. They're the ones who do it. Now, under them, and they're very pro-Common Core. Okay, they've taken money from Bill and Melinda Gates. They've been the big pushers of the Common Core. They're the ones who've graded Wyoming standards as poor. People in Wyoming who are in favor of the Common Core love to use the Fordham Institute to show, hey, listen, the Common Core grades so much better than Wyoming's old standards, this is why we should have them. The problem with that is these same people like the next generation science standards, but the Fordham Institute graded them very poorly. You can't have it both ways.
Because there are groups out there, and we talked about them last time that you were on, that said that the next generation science standards were wonderful. Well, they said they were wonderful based on what? Because I looked at them and I was a little confused. How are these great standards? Why?
Well, I think Yeah, I think most of the groups that we've seen that love these standards are doing it for their own specific individual issues. I mean, groups like Climate Parents that are not Wyoming, it's not a Wyoming organization, have come into this state and they have an agenda. It's very clear that they have an agenda. It's not necessarily about whether or not we're going to equip our students to be able to become chemists or physicists or engineers in the future. It's their agenda about the climate that they want taught in our schools. We have to look at these standards based on all of science and whether they're good, and they're not. They're not good standards.
Well, let me go back real quick and touch on Gillette again. When you have a school system that's been told to stop implementing these next generation science standards, but they're still continuing to train for these standards, what do we do about that?
Well, this is where local control is so important. I mean, again, in maintaining that consistency about who should have the final say in education, your district absolutely can implement these standards because they're anticipatory. They're thinking that in the future the state's probably going to adopt the standards and they're probably going to test for these standards. But local parents in that community need to be talking to their local school board and saying, why are you converting? We don't like these standards. We want them gone. That's why at the end of the day, any education policy can't be just about local control in the district. Because you're right, districts are doing things that, you know, I don't think a lot of parents would agree with. Education policy has to come down to parents and children. Parents in Gillette should have the right to move their children somewhere else if they don't want them taught under these next generation science standards.
Since we've talked about money coming from the federal government, which seems to be the driving factor in this, what about those who would worry about if Wyoming went after its own standards that we wouldn't have enough money to run our schools?
Well, I mean, that's just, if you look at the amount of federal funds we actually take, we take about $240 million in federal funds. Our annual budget is $1.3 to $1.5 billion that we shoulder here in Wyoming. We're paying that. We're paying for that. We can easily remove federal funds and have the freedom in education, and we will still be able to pay for education. That's very clear.
Well, let's take a look at the numbers here, because I've never really looked into the numbers like that before. So we're over $1 billion here. There's a little over 500,000 people in the state. How many of those people are students that are benefiting from over $1 billion? It doesn't seem like we need that much money. Am I wrong? Or?
Well, yeah. I mean, we're one of the highest per pupil student dollars in the country. I mean, we spend on average $16,000 per child to educate our children. So this question of losing federal funds and not being able to continue to pay for education is just simply not the case, not in Wyoming. And the way I like to look at it, Glenn, and I think this is a good analogy, if you had a company where you had 7 to 10% of the shareholders dictating everything your company does, would you allow that? Of course not. Of course not. So why is Wyoming allowing this small amount of federal funds to dictate everything we do?
Okay, so in our governor's race, we have Taylor Haynes, who's anti-Common Core. Cindy Hill told me she's anti-Common Core. But we have Governor Matt Mead. I still don't understand exactly where he stands on this, although he has been busy trying to implement Common Core. Has he stood up against it, or has he said that he's going to implement it? Where does Governor Mead stand on it?
My understanding of Governor Mead's position on the Common Core is similar to yours. I think what the governor likes to say is that he wants better standards, and he certainly, in not just what he says, but what he has been doing for the past 4 years, it's very clear that he supports the Common Core. Now, I don't think I've ever heard him really come out and specifically say he thinks they're great standards. He just says that they're better than our old standards, and we have to have good standards. But Wyoming can do so much better than the Common Core standards, and we should. And again, Glenn, initiating federal education policy and calling it good Wyoming education policy is insane.
Right. But surely those by now in Cheyenne, not just the governor's office, but staff and representatives have heard the outcry. They must have heard the opposition by now.
Well, they have, and it's not going to go away. I mean, it just keeps happening. I don't know if the last time I was on I mentioned to you, Glenn, but here in Laramie County, the local school district had an event where they had parents come and speak about the Common Core. It was an hour and a half, and it was literally an hour and a half of parent after parent after parent. The reality is, it doesn't matter how much marketing you put into these standards, and it doesn't matter how much you talk about how we're all, giving myths and we're not. These are bad standards, and parents know it because they're seeing it on the kitchen table. every night in their homes. You can't make that go away as much as you want to. It's a reality, and it will continue to be a reality for whoever makes these policy decisions in the future.
I've been talking to Amy Edmonds from Wyoming Liberty Group. So you've written some articles about this. Where can people find your articles?
Wyliberty.org. wyliberty.org.
All right. As always, Amy, good to see you again. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.